Talking Europe.
Talking Europe. Talking Europe.
Talking Europe.
Talking Europe. Talking Europe. A podcast by the European Democracy Institute in collaboration with Europapodcast.
Herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Folge des Europapodcasts. Wer kontrolliert eigentlich die digitale Welt? Sind Google, Meta, OpenAI und andere Technologiekonzerne nur erfolgreiche Unternehmen? Oder entsteht hier eine neue Machtstruktur, die demokratische Institutionen zunehmend herausfordert? Darüber sprechen wir in dieser Folge mit Professor Dr. Michael Weinman aus den USA. Weinman forscht an der Schnittstelle von politischer Theorie, Technologie und Demokratie und beschäftigt sich aktuell mit dem Konzept der Tech-Oligarchie. Gemeint ist damit die Konzentration wirtschaftlicher, technologischer und politischer Macht in den Händen weniger Akteure, die nicht nur Märkte, sondern zunehmend auch öffentliche Debatten und politische Entscheidungsprozesse beeinflussen. Im Gespräch geht es um Datenhoheit, künstliche Intelligenz, die Rolle von Plattformen, die Zukunft demokratischer Kontrolle im digitalen Zeitalter und die Frage, ob Europa ein Gegengewicht zur Dominanz amerikanischer Technologiekonzerne entwickeln kann. Ein Gespräch über Demokratie, Macht und die politische Ordnung des 21. Jahrhunderts. Ich wünsche euch viel Spaß beim Zuhören. Welcome to a new episode of the Europapodcast. I'm very pleased to welcome our guest today, Professor Dr. Michael Weinman from the United States of America. We are recording this interview via Zoom. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see you again. We already met earlier this year in Berlin, and now that you are back in the United States, I'm glad we have the opportunity to continue our conversation. Today, we will be discussing a topic that has been increasingly important in recent years, tech oligarchy. You have written and researched intensively on this subject. So let's start with the basic questions for our listeners. When you use the term tech oligarchy, what exactly do you mean? What is the core of this concept? Is it primarily about ownership and market power, about control over digital infrastructure, or are we witnessing the emergence of a new form of political rule?
Yeah, I think that our investigation of this concept of tech oligarchy or techno-oligarchy or technologarchy. There are different versions of the portmanteau word at the core of the investigation. Comes out of a series of conversations I had with a friend and colleague who is an intellectual historian and historian of science, and the connection between science and the state. And so I think each part of the concept is really crucial for it, so that it is about techne or technique, technology, as we say in English, but really just the nothing ideological or intellectual, but rather the actual practice of creating, of know-how, of a knowing, techne originally in Greek, right? A form of knowing that is, that produces, that is productive. So it starts there. And then I think that kind of gives shape to the oligarchy aspect of the concept, because it is to do with ownership for sure. Oligarchy, both classically and in the 20th century, has been a key term of political thought that has to do with moneyed interests. The connection between owning the means of production, we might say, and through the ownership of the means of production, having either an oversized influence on government or simply co-opting government. And that was already diagnosed as oligarchy in ancient times. That's an aspect of oligarchy as the term was used already by Plato and Aristotle. And certainly, as part of the sort of early modern understanding of oligarchy as the political influence and political power amassed by at that time emerging urban economic elites, especially in Italy, maybe say in the city states and in parts of the German speaking world. But then later as well in the Netherlands and in England. And yeah, how that carries out into the 20th century. So we definitely want in our analysis, and I didn't name my colleague, this is Rodolfo Garral, who's at the Technische Universität in Nuremberg now. We put together this workshop in January on the concept, and we're working on an edited volume out of it, and other research initiatives and so we really want to give as much as possible equal attention and also conjunctive attention to the technique part of it and the oligarchy part of it, and to be mindful of the interface of science, technology, and society on the one hand, on political economy, and then also on political theory and how we understand state, market, society relations. So the ambition is really to be thinking about all those things conjunctively, all together, not to separate out the technology aspect and the other political economic and political thought aspects, but to think them all together.
One aspect I found particularly interesting in your workshop is that it did not treat technology as an isolated phenomenon. Instead, it brought together technology, globalization, and democracy. These three forces seem deeply interconnected, but it's not always clear which one is driving the others. In your view, what is the key relationship here? Is the platform power primarily a driver of globalization, or is globalization instead the condition that enables platform power?
Yes. So I think it's an excellent question, so certainly, let's say we begin by noticing the essential contribution of each of the corners of that triangle, right? That the particular, the particular formation of technology and oligarchy in this sense could not possibly manifest without the contemporary form of globalization and the accelerative forces thereof. I think that we have not yet framed what I would say to be our ultimate analysis, I have to say. I think different contributors would answer the question in different ways. So I think some of them see, some of the contributors to the volume see globalization itself as the driving force, and that the complete reformation of the distribution of power on the basis of huge and unprecedented concentrations of wealth and denationalization of wealth through globalization is the driving force. So I think some of the contributors certainly see it that way, and for that reason, see the challenge of responding to the formation of technoligarchic concentrations of wealth and power as being the deployment of national and regional particularly maybe, in the case of Daniele Archibugi, one of the contributors using the European Union itself as the mechanism by which to somehow correct or curtail this seemingly unstoppable and ever expanding concentration of wealth and power in the hands of these technoligarchs, who then essentially have the capacity to overwhelm the state's ability to carry out democratic will, even if those democratic nation states are inclined to carry out endogenous, authentic, democratic will for a nation. So I think there are those who would argue it that way, that globalization itself is the driving force here and the dominant factor. I'm not sure that we, as editors, Professor Grau and myself, if our view is that it's necessarily from that direction. But for sure, it's what's undeniable is that the fact of globalization and the possibility structure that it has created has been exploited by the technoligarchs in order to for the time being at least overwhelm any check on their action from democratically elected national governments.
Services, we eventually arrive at the question of data. Yet, politically speaking, there is still not consensus on what data actually is. Is it property, infrastructure, a straight resource, or something else entirely? And if we go further, data sovereignty and data governance were central themes of the workshop you had held here in Berlin. Where do you see the most important political leverage point? Should data be understood primarily as a private property, as a critical infrastructure, or as a matter of public responsibility?
This is one of the really central themes of the volume as it came together. And in terms of the diagnosis, I think, we as contributors are universally agreed that we do not have a governance structure that is adapted to the realities of the contemporary data environment, right? So we have essentially an 18th century we have an 18th century model of data as property that, of course, the law is aware, and that there are many, many, many bright people, who work in, intellectual property and are fully aware, of the data revolution of the 20th and 21st century. But, insofar as, of course, with the development of generative AI, it's not so much anymore data storage as data implantation or implementation that is also involved. We have our digital doppelgangers who are, living in the cloud. And so, like, when we ask the question, whose data, which many of the contributions do, right, we mean that both in the sense of data about whom, data of whom, and data from whom. But all our ways of thinking, propositions, of course, translate with difficulty, right? But, is it data that we're creating and then keeping? But our intellectual property, right, is still understood, or we try to mediate and regulate it through a model of authorship that just isn't applicable to the current data environment. So, so for that reason, I do think, yeah, data sovereignty or data governance is a profound challenge, and so the contributors who weigh in on this all agree um, that it's a really profound challenge for regulation and for more democratic governance of and maintaining something like equality as digital citizens or something like that. But then the answers as to how to achieve that, frankly, vary pretty significantly among the contributors, right? Whether the response needs to come from national governments and the way that they contract with big data with large technology companies to maintain their own digital resources and information technology and data security and all sorts of questions like that, or whether whether some regional, some supranational structure is needed to create an entirely new regulatory environment that essentially will curtail rather than adapt and work with the big, with big data and the large tech companies. So different contributors have different answers on that question, and for sure, that's one of the biggest challenges when it comes to the ungovernability of, or the inability to check um, the the leadership of these big data firms, who increasingly are themselves these avowed what we're naming technoligarchs, but maybe also have other names. So those two pieces come together: the ideological piece and just the and the state sovereignty piece, which is a potentially really devastating combination for the prospects, frankly, of democracy in the face of this formation.
So public debates often portray technology leaders as business figures driven mainly by economic interests. But some of these contributions discussed in your workshop here suggest that parts of the tech elite are pursuing broader ideological ambitions as well. Your contribution on Peter Thiel suggests that parts of the tech elite are pursuing not only economic interests, but also broader ideological projects. How coherent are these projects, and to what extent are they already shaping institutions, political parties, and public discourses?
Right. Thanks. Yeah, no, this is more my, and I should say in this regard, I'd really be speaking for myself and not my co-editor, the other contributors. Although I think versions of this argument are present among others of our contributors. That namely, so what we share, at least say 3 or 4 of us, I think, what we share is an interest in the centrality of the connection between the ideological formation that can be called, I believe, technoligarchy, or has been called by, for instance, our contributor, Camilla Vergara, elective oligarchy, is her phrase, or Alessandro Mogliari and other contributors spoken about technomonarchism, technomonarchia, noting that certain of these figures outright advocate for, like, Aristotle's conception, or really Dante's conception of Aristotle's conception of monarchy as the best form of government today. So, but whether it's elective oligarchy or technomonarchy or technoligarchy, what we're saying, and then in my own contribution on the example of Peter Thiel, who I think is singular, but not totally unique, so to say. I mean, he's a single case, but he's representative, of a of a pattern that, that has a handful of exemplars who sit very close to power. Alessandro Molieri, who I mentioned earlier, who has a contribution, has thought also about Curtis Yarvin, Patrick Deneen, Elon Musk, people who are rarely academics. Patrick Deneen is an academic and write works of political theory, but they're all individuals who think of themselves as thought leaders and who write, and in almost every case publish monographs. Perhaps they self-publish. However seriously they're taken by the theory establishment or by academics. They're working as ideologues, in the classic sense. And I think we collectively, and certainly I individually, believe that it's necessary to take that very seriously. That this is not, this is not like a sideline, sort of quaint interest of these armchair thinkers, but it really is integral to the social change they see themselves as the vanguard of. So, right, intellectuals, how much did they ever influence the world, et cetera, et cetera. But these are self-conscious thought leaders who have, telephone access to the halls of power and understand themselves quite robustly and with a good degree of detail as bringing about a new political order which they see as necessary to save Western civilization from itself. And I know, and so speaking only for myself, and I know the contributors as a whole, but they are often adjacent to ideologues or, what does one want to say exactly? Thinkers, I guess, of some kind who are outright racist, xenophobic, hateful, alt-right, we say in the US. A term I generally wouldn't throw around, but in many cases, quite literally neo-Nazi. Thinkers, if you could call them that, or ideologues who recently, they were just now, right, the federal police have cracked down on these groups. So I want to say they're adjacent. The technologards, in their ideological contributions, are adjacent to that world, but I want to say they're really distinct from it. And whoever we are, who are concerned about the practical consequences of political thought, have to take them much more seriously. Right, that's the idea of the volume. One key aspect of it is that we have to take their ideological labor much more seriously, I think, than we have been. It's not the online manifestos of these new fascist organizations, which have to be taken seriously by the police, but don't need to be taken seriously intellectually. Whereas I think, to be plain, whereas I think that the technologarchs really do need to be taken seriously intellectually, because there is a non-trivial connection between the institutional, economic, and science, technology, society dimensions of their power, their capacity, power in that sense, and the thought labor that they're doing. And it's part of an integrated ideological vision, and part of what we're trying to do in the volume is to make those linkages, not just to notice how their capacities exceed the regulatory power of the state, which is very important, but also to see how their intellectual practices are spreading through their ability to carry out their vision unchecked by those regulatory powers.
One concept that immediately caught my attention was the idea of tech monarchy. It sounds provocative, but it raises an important question about whether some influential actors in the technology sector are moving beyond traditional democratic frameworks altogether. Some contributors discuss visions of tech monarchy. Do you see an anti-democratic tendency or a growing attention to authoritarian forms of order within parts of the tech world? And how could we identify such developments empirically?
Yeah. I do think this is one of the more chilling, frankly, aspects of the volume, and the issue of technologarchy. So, yes, so Sandro Molieri in particular has spoken about technomonarchy or technomonarchia. And it is true that this in particular might be in the thought of Patrick Deneen and Curtis Yarvin, who are, they're based in the United States. I mean, one in Bay Area, a technoligarch, if there ever was one, that's Curtis Yarvin. Patrick Deneen is associated with Catholic integralism, which also has strong advocates in France and in Belgium. So that's a sort of transatlantic intellectual formation. So the idea would be this kind of, if you like, forgive me, like unholy alliance between a very ostensibly secular, perfectionist kind of a dystopian, maybe broadly speaking, Nietzschean, or it thinks itself anyway, as coming out of a tradition of thought from Friedrich Nietzsche, a kind of Twilight of the Idols style Nietzschean apocalypticism, with this, much more sort of traditional seeming Catholic conservatism. But what they're both advocating for, and get to the can you empirically test this, but at least in terms of its coherence as a thought structure, is that it's very anti-democratic in the sense that they're advocating for for anti-liberal democratic, right? They may or may not be explicitly against one person, one vote, and other sort of institutionally democratic procedures and so on. But they're against this idea, that we take for granted, of a state, a just and decent state, being one that is pluralist and embraces the separation of church and state. So secular in some sense, and one in which representation through majoritarian vote is the one and only basis of political legitimacy. So they, and they outright advocate for that, and they increasingly see the changing, the changing technocratic environment as particularly conducive to bringing about their vision. So maybe they're intellectually consistent in, between how much of this is normative and how much of this is descriptive. But from their perspective, Yarvin and Thiel's in particular here now, maybe Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel in particular, there's an optimism about the collapse of the liberal democratic form as we know it, because that is the means by which this sort of intellectually superior, as they see it, intellectually superior class will come to restore greatness to Western civilization through, right. And then, Alessandra Molieri has described through a form of technomonarchy. Um, but, right, as our suggestion overall as the volume is thinking of it as technologarchy, not so much about, right, on the understanding that it's not so much about, in an abstract, theoretical sense, what the best form of government would be, whether it would be a monarch, quite literally a restoration of the absolute monarchical form, or whether it would be a kind of rule by the by uh, by the wealthy, by the economic elite. But the idea that you'd have this concentration of power that would be legitimized by everyone living in this like thoroughgoingly technocratic future. How do we empirically testify? I mean, I think that's a good question, but I think one of the issues that we get into, and this is particularly true of Camilla Vergara's contribution and Audrey Borofsky's, is the way that digital citizens are complicit in this de-democratization by voluntarily participating in this technoligarchic system through our economic activity and voluntarily ceding sovereignty to the tech giants who are using their great resources of wealth and political influence to further decapitate the democratic political system, to the extent it was ever democratic anyway. Yeah.
Artificial intelligence has emerged as one of the defining themes of our time. Proponents see in it enormous opportunities, while critics warn of unprecedented concerns of power. It remains unclear, however, whether AI merely reinforces existing structures or fundamentally transforms them. In any case, Michael, artificial intelligence is frequently described as a key driver of power concentration. In your view, does AI primarily reinforce existing power structures, or does it fundamentally alter the very nature and logic of power itself?
Yeah, I think that this really gets to, a little bit, some time ago we were discussing how all of the contributors would agree that the question of data sovereignty is integral to both diagnosing what's happening with technologarchy and thinking about what are the possibilities for a political challenge to it. And I think here, with artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, we really get to the crux of the matter, where I think, right, we all as contributors would agree, and I think a sort of sober analysis could, anyone, who kind of looks at the question with any degree of seriousness for any degree of time would agree that that if I mean, if it weren't already the case with other domains of the new digital economy, then certainly with generative AI, it becomes clear that globalization has advanced to a point where it's impossible to think about the nation state as the relevant level of governance to have any hope of regulating this. In the United States, we have the particular problem where to date, only one state has actively made efforts to somehow, regulate AI, and it's really just symbolic. And because the federal government won't. But even the United States, which is still for some amount of time the most powerful nation state in the world, the truth was, like, even if there were political will to somehow try to, regulate or it would curtail or at least contain this sort of, the word that's coming to mind that I'm trying to avoid is like monster, but monster in like Aristotle sense, like this unprecedented sort of creature, that more so than financialization or other things that have sort of exceeded the existing regulatory framework, generative AI really brings us into a new world, like in a very genuine and but mundane way of day to day, uh, um, issues like what's real and what's unreal, et cetera. Once 2 million people have reposted a social media post, what difference does it make if that image was AI generated or not, et cetera? So, so that's the scaling and, so both the scale and the speed, however you want it, the obviously ostensibly deterritorialized aspect of generative AI embodies that first quantitative side of data sovereignty and the incredible challenges, maybe impossible, that face us when we try to think about how to regulate that in any way. And any hope for sort of data governance. But I also think, me personally, and I'm not sure if that's a consensus in the volume or not, but as your question raises, that there's a qualitative dimension to it as well. And I think that's what, so Audrey Borofsky's contribution, for instance, and also Sri Agrahatri's contribution get into this aspect, which is authorship, authority, personhood, that aspect. That it's, so like if we think about digital citizenship, the scaling problem and like that first issue is just citizens of what, right? Of which nation state and so on, and they don't interface with we don't interface with platforms that in any way are nationalized in the way our political citizenship is nationalized. That's that one set of problems. But the other problem over here is the who are we type problems. And I do think, right, they're a huge, they're a huge ontological, if maybe even metaphysical questions about what is an I, who is a subject, who are, and so, the participants in social media are increasingly not avatars of single human beings in the world. They're participating in this. So who are we who are in that media scape? How could we even try to keep track of something like intellectual property, but also, for that matter, like our subjectivity even changes. So it's, I think those qualitative dimensions are, right, on the one hand, sort of fascinating, but then on the other hand, really, really challenging / disheartening, because it's very difficult to sort of wrap your head around what even could be a responsible governing agency to deal with these sorts of new political subjectivities. Yeah.
Some of the language used in your workshops is remarkably strong. Terms such as techno-fascist landscape inevitably raise questions about where legitimate technology governments ends and authoritarian tendency begins. One contribution even raised is the notion of a techno-fascist landscape. Where, in your view, is the line between legitimate technology governments and the kind of authoritarian dynamics that digital platforms and AI systems may enable?
Two of the contributions really go into this issue, and they present to me kind of two distinct models for how this could be cognized. One of them, and this is the contribution of Rodolfo Corral, my co-editor, really looks into the historical corollary or, example of the same thing, but the historical analogy, I guess you could say, of the apparatus, the state market apparatus that developed around the National Socialist Party in the, in the pre-war period. So, in between 1933 and 1938 in particular. And that's where I think you get the techno-fascist. And I think it's a fascinating, such I've avoided the word parallel because it's not the same thing. But, and through Neumann's analysis, which is largely, or not particularly attended to, and here I'm really just narrating my recollection of Rodolfo's Corral's argument, but which I'm sure he could do better. But the basic idea would be that where the legitimate sort of participatory, competitive interplay of market factors and state to sort of congealed into a fascist, a techno-fascist alignment was precisely when individual actors and institutional actors lost any internal checks on their behavior. And so the idea being that that's a formation that obtains with, with that particular pre-war single party political system that perhaps is reemerging today. So that's one kind of diagnosis for where you would perhaps be able to make a distinction between, kind of formations of oligarchic power within a, within a popular system and something that's outright authoritarian. And I guess the other one, the other sort of model that's suggested in the volume is one in which any conception of voluntary membership is based on our activity in the market as being already, sort of anticipatorily oligarchic in this way. And this, I think, is like the suggestion of the contributions from Camilla Vergara and Andrei Borowski, which are more skeptical of economic, institutions and actors and our participation in markets in the first place, and that they're, the only real, I think, they would be saying, and on this model, the only real response and sort of democratic promise is in restructuring the property relations themselves. So some form of like digital materialism or something like that. Like just having a mediascape that is not yeah, that's not advanced liquid capitalist in this way. Right. So the one model is more about state market relations and the way that intermediate associations and the state could put a check on these phenomena of turning us into increasingly subjects of an increasingly authoritarian, or in any case, anti-democratic, that data sovereigntist system. That would be sort of following like this kind of Frankfurt School analysis, and then this other analysis over here, which is no, the only real alternative to this is some sort of, populism, essentially, some sort of, retaking of, of the ownership of, in this case, not the means of production, but of the data itself. That would be the only hope.
Since this is the Europa podcast, I would like to shift the focus to Europe. Much of the debate around big tech is dominated by developments in the United States and increasingly China. Europe often presents itself as a different model, emphasizing regulation, competition policy, and fundamental rights. So let us shift the focus to Europe. The challenge posed by big tech was a major theme of your workshop here in Berlin. Where do you see Europeans' strength, whether in regulation, competition policy, or the protection of fundamental rights? And where do you see its most significant blind spots?
So I think we as a whole, and this was particularly Daniela Archibugi's contribution. So yes, for sure. The environment is very different. I think that on the one hand, there certainly has been much more of an appetite to regulate, in particular, these recognizable large tech firms, and maybe most of all, Meta and Google, or Alphabet now. And that would be that surely seems to us, I think I can speak for all the contributors, that seems to us better than essentially the complete regulatory failure in the US. On the other hand, I think just to start with the bald empirical observations, while there have been attempts to sort of grow autochthonous alternatives to especially the large the LLMs, so the generative AI competitors who are, China has a significant platform, and the US does, but there isn't to date, genuine European alternatives. And, I think more pressingly, that's true of social media, insofar as from a mediascape perspective, right, it's social media where digital citizenship manifests. I mean, if there is a public sphere, right, if we're thinking about, sort of traditional analyses of state society market relations, and where there's a possibility for real democratic governance, that's where it would be. And so, absent some sort of corporatist or state capitalist or collectivist or, anarchical, but some sort of genuine alternative to the, in some sense, American, but of course global, big tech firms. The fact of the regulatory environment being more user friendly doesn't really, and the data protection promises, which are sincere and better that they're there than not, but it doesn't really, I guess our analysis would be, it doesn't really confront the biggest challenges of technologarchy, right? There's some other more radical, some other more radical use of the power and capacity and just the size of the European common market would be needed to really pose a kind of challenge to the U.S. dominated technoligarchic landscape.
Yeah.
Would be the sort of, not that that's wished for, but like that would be, yeah.
Listening to your analysis, one gets the impression that Europe and the United States faced almost opposite challenges. Europe appears willing to regulate but often lacks the necessary instruments, while the United States possesses enormous capabilities but seems reluctant to use them. Would it be fair to say that Europe is a regulator without sovereignty, while the United States remains sovereign but lacks the political will to regulate?
Maybe the U.S. isn't even sovereign really anymore, but right. I mean, the U.S. The U.S. has the government of the United States has far greater prospects for being an effective regulator than the European Union. So in Europe, there's a will to regulate, but not a capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we could put it that way. And in the US, there's maybe still a capacity, although just barely, but there's no will. But the most sobering aspect of that would be that there's a very short time window until like there won't be the capacity even. And so the worry would be that we're sort of wasting a key decade or even less than a decade in which this sort of accelerating technologarchic drift or push, maybe it's not a drift, maybe it's a push, could be resisted, right? And so we somehow need to harness, realistically, what it would require is harnessing the will that there seems to be in Europe with the capacity that there is in the United States into something that would be supranational and would somehow redivert this sort of increasingly focused state power and market power drive toward what we're calling technologarchy, toward meaning ultimately, like, right, the algorithmic practices in their profitability being what ultimately shapes the public sphere, which increasingly is online anyway.
So every edited volume brings together different perspectives, arguments, and approaches, yet readers are usually left with one overarching insight that ties everything together. Looking ahead to the publication, what is one central thesis or takeaway that you hope readers will take away from the project?
Right. I mean, I do think we are in the end, so can't say an outlet and a date. I mean, it's things are in consideration, but I think we've agreed that what brings our contributions together would be best manifested in the type of journal that itself, is open access. So that's what we're kind of looking at. But that tries to intervene, so a journal that's trying to intervene in the public discussion. So a kind of, public philosophy type outlet, and the thesis then of the volume, or sort of, if not quite a thesis, the organizing principle of the volume would be something like what I just said, right? That there is a window of time that is not indefinitely long for sure, but nevertheless exists, in which this phenomenon named technologarchy can be understood and addressed. And the volume as a whole, I think, should be understood as a call to come to a shared diagnosis, roughly, so that we, in the hopes that civil society actors, public sphere actors such as ourselves, as informed citizens, as scholars, but as informed citizens of this, digital mediascape can push back ultimately against the anti-democratic, the essentially, not accidentally, but really essentially anti-democratic aspects of technology.
A great deal of our conversation has focused on diagnosis. We have discussed concentrations of power, challenges to democracy, data governance, and the implications of artificial intelligence. The obvious question is what follows from this analysis. If we move from diagnosis to action, what do you see as the most important next steps for policymakers, civil society, and ordinary citizens?
Some of the contributors, and I fully respect it, are focused on ways that state and regional and perhaps like global community bodies, UN type bodies can either can engage in regulatory governance, and that seems to me that certainly needs to be advocated for and pushed as much as possible. But I do think that there was a consensus among us as contributors, and speaking for myself personally, that the bigger, the more pressing concern and the more promising development is not in regulation, but in the creation of new forms of, digital democratic citizenship. And whether that means what exactly that, what that entails, sort of ceasing to feed the beast, right? So it's sort of similar to anti-apartheid activism once upon a time, using consumer power, using the boycott, essentially. Are there potentials for that? Are there potentials for, new participating in new social media environments that are not, owned and managed for profit by the technoligarchs? Less immediately concrete, perhaps, steps that we could take, but nevertheless, maybe more promising ones. I mean, that's what I would say. And, some of us as contributors will also, sort of aside from the scholarly, output of the special issue, hopefully sometime later this year, aim to contribute to a kind of online seminar through the democracy seminar that I co-edited as part of the European Democracy Institute. So that's really about these sorts of questions, and hopefully would continue to generate both further thought, but also, new publics. That would be the hope. Counter publics specifically.
Michael, thank you very much for joining us today. This conversation has taken us from questions of technology and political economy to democracy, sovereignty, and the future of digital citizenship. These are issues that affect all of us, even if we are not always aware of it. So thank you for sharing your insights and for giving us a glimpse into this fascinating research project. We wish you very success with the publication and look forward to following the debate it will undoubtedly generate. Thank you very much for being our guest here in the Europapodcast.
Talking Europe.
Talking Europe. Talking Europe.
Talking Europe.
Talking Europe.
Talking Europe, a podcast by the European Democracy Institute in collaboration with Europapodcast.